What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Thomas Take Sports Podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Thomas, bringing you another edition of the Thomas Take. If you have not heard, I'm making hats, t-shirts, hoodies. Those will be ready within the next few weeks for anyone that is interested. Feel free to hit me up on Facebook. Looking to get the word out on the show a little bit more. Working with a few bands to record a theme song for the show, and shit's about to get real. So, that being said, tonight I want to talk about the first part of the show tonight. I want to talk about the newest UFC matchups that have been announced for the next few cards, the next two cards, post-UFC in Buffalo, UFC 210. UFC 211 had two fights added onto it. Frankie Edgar will be taking on Yair Rodriguez. Yair Rodriguez is coming off a victory over BJ Penn. Frankie Edgar is coming off a loss to Jose Aldo. So it'll be very interesting to see how Frankie Edgar comes into the octagon for this fight. Frankie Edgar was recently on a podcast show stating that he feels as if he could be a stepping stone. It was the Anik and Florian show where Frankie felt that he could be a stepping stone for Yair Rodriguez. He could be put in a stepping stone situation. And that is definitely, most definitely the case. The UFC is propping him up. Actually, as I correct myself, Frankie actually had a win over Jeremy Stevens. So that victory was his last fight, which was, let's see here, UFC 205. Yeah, that was the big card. UFC 200, 205, and then he'll be in 211 in Dallas, Texas, where he'll take on Yair Rodriguez. Now, you know, I think Yair Rodriguez is a great talent. I've put him in articles a bunch of times stating that I very well think he could be the 145-pound champion, the next UFC featherweight champion somewhere down the line. I still hold true to that statement, but I think this might be too little too soon for Yair Rodriguez. He has a lot of talent. He has a lot of skill inside the octagon, but Frankie Edgar is a legitimate world champion caliber fighter that might be a little bit too soon for Yair Rodriguez. He's coming off that win over BJ Penn, but we all know BJ Penn is not where he once was, and he's far out of his prime. So, I can't really hold much stock into that fight. Yair Rodriguez was virtually in no danger throughout the entirety of that fight for how long it lasted, and Frankie Edgar is a different style, in-and-out fighter. Quickness is his go-to, in-and-out, stick and move, in-and-out Tasmanian devil style, and he's a tough SOB. So it'll be very interesting to see how Yair Rodriguez approaches Frankie Edgar in this fight. It'll be very interesting to see how Edgar approaches Yair. Yair definitely outsizes Edgar, but Frankie a time or two has beaten men that are much bigger than him. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens in that fight. Also, you have Eddie Alvarez taking on Dustin Poirier at UFC 211. Eddie Alvarez coming off that loss to Conor McGregor in which he lost his UFC lightweight title. His bounce-back fight is one in which he'll be put up against a guy that has won 5 of his last 6 in Dustin Poirier, coming off a win over the game-durable Jim Miller, a veteran of the UFC. It'll be very interesting to see what comes of that fight. You know, what Eddie Alvarez will we see after the practically humiliating loss to Conor McGregor at UFC 205, and Dustin Poirier is on a hot streak. How will he approach the game plan of trying to defeat the former champion Eddie Alvarez? If Dustin Poirier can pull off a win, it's a huge win for his career. If Eddie Alvarez can get a win over a guy that's hot, it puts him right back into that title contention. So that'll be a very interesting fight. And last but not least, Kelvin Gastelum defeated Vitor Belfort this past Saturday. Afterwards, Gastelum announced who he wanted to fight next, and that was none other than former UFC middleweight champion Anderson Silva. That fight is made. UFC 212, Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. I don't know if it's the main event. I do know it's not the main event. Jose Aldo versus Max Holloway will be on that card as the main event. But that is an interesting fight. Kelvin Gastelum is not the biggest middleweight. And Anderson Silva is Anderson Silva. He's not the Anderson Silva of old, but he has shown glimpses of being the Anderson Silva of old. Will that be enough to get a win versus Gastelum? Within these three fights, they could change the entire trajectory of Edgar, Alvarez, and Silva's career. If Gastelum beats Anderson Silva, his days as a contender in the UFC middleweight division are all but over. Anderson Silva's days as a contender are gone. If Eddie Alvarez loses his second straight fight to Dustin Poirier, he is out of the title picture, far out of the title picture. A guy that lost his title via finish in a champion versus champion fight on the grandest stage. And if he loses to a guy like Dustin Poirier, which is quite possible, I'm not saying that that's going to happen, but it is possible, being that Poirier has put on a clinic in his last few fights. If Alvarez loses this fight to Poirier, it really could be a reset for Eddie Alvarez, a career reset. So Eddie Alvarez needs to show up for this fight, unlike he did in UFC 205, and everything should go just fine. On one side of Frankie Edgar does not live up to expectation versus Yair Rodriguez. Yair Rodriguez becomes the next number one contender with a win over Frankie Edgar. If Frankie Edgar beats Yair Rodriguez, he's again in contention for that featherweight title. Do they do Aldo versus Edgar 3 if Aldo gets past Max Holloway? That's a big question, because Aldo has beaten Edgar twice, and if Max Holloway beats Jose Aldo, which I think he actually will, is Max Holloway a good matchup for Frankie Edgar? I don't think so. So Frankie is kind of at a weird point in his career right now. Things are lined up for him to lose versus Yair Rodriguez. As he said, he is the stepping stone in this fight, and being not at the back end of Frankie Edgar is not at the back end of his career. It's more so the fact that he has been given title shot opportunities, and it didn't pan out in the UFC featherweight division. He was the former lightweight champion. He fought to a draw with Gray Maynard. He fought a real close fight with Benson Henderson. He fought 2 close fights with BJ Penn. So he's had a lot of mileage on him inside the UFC octagon, being that the majority of his fights have been in UFC title fights. So the next step for Frankie Edgar is going to be very, very interesting. What do they decide to do with Frankie, win or lose? What do they decide to do with Anderson Silva if he gets past Kelvin Gastelum? Eddie Alvarez will be put back in the Tony Conor mixture if he can get past Dustin Poirier and throwing Nate Diaz in there too. I was really hoping that they would put Nate Diaz together with Eddie Alvarez, but that did not happen. Nate Diaz made it known that he wants Conor McGregor next, as have most fighters. So only time will tell, but I really like these 3 matchups. Silva versus Gastelum, Edgar versus Yair Rodriguez, and then Eddie Alvarez versus Dustin Poirier. Very excited for these 3 fights. I'm hoping, given how stacked UFC 211 is in Dallas, Texas, given how stacked that card is for May, I'm really hoping that the UFC 210 card in Buffalo gets another fight added onto it that would make a world of a difference inside that octagon in Buffalo. Tickets are limited; they're not sold out yet. I got mine. I hope you MMA listeners, MMA fans got yours. I'm very excited for the fight. Very excited for the public weigh-in. I'll be attending both. And I'm definitely going to talk about it on the show. As not as it happens live, I'll be watching the fights, but after it happens the following day, doing my post-fight reaction to Daniel Cormier and Anthony Rumble Johnson. Next up on the Thomas Take, I want to talk about Daniel Cormier's reaction to the UFC 210 poster. What do I think about that? Also tonight, as I advertised on Facebook, I want to talk about the Tyrod Taylor contract. Some things that I've read, some things that, some thoughts I have, I should say, on the contract itself, and what I think should be next. So there you have it, guys. Part 1, who do I think will win these fights? I'm going to go with Frankie Edgar. I'm going to go with Eddie Alvarez. And to throw a curveball in the mix, I'm going to go with Anderson Silva. I think Frankie Edgar is too experienced for Yair Rodriguez at this point. I do think that this is a big fight for Yair, but I think it might be a little bit too much too soon. And in terms of the Eddie Alvarez fight, Eddie's back is virtually against the wall. He knows he has to win this fight. Dustin Poirier did not have the greatest showing versus Michael Johnson. I think Eddie Alvarez is tailor-made for Dustin Poirier to fall. So, in the next fight, Anderson Silva versus Calvin Gastelum. Gastelum, as I stated earlier, is a little bit too small of a middleweight while fighting a guy like Anderson Silva who has fought at light heavyweight. So that'll be very interesting. What will we see from that? And I think Anderson Silva could knock out Calvin Gastelum. That is the Thomas Take Part 1. Tune in for the Thomas Take Part 2. I'm going to talk about UFC 210 in Buffalo.